Pachyderm Recording Studio, Cannon Falls, Minnesota, February 20, 1993. The world knew Dave Grohl as Nirvana's powerhouse drummer, the 24-year-old kid who joined the band in 1990 and helped transform them from underground sensations into the voice of a generation. But on a freezing Saturday night in rural Minnesota, inside a converted barn that doubled as a recording studio, Dave Grohl discovered something about Kurt Cobain that would change everything he thought he understood about his friend and bandmate. He found Kurt alone in the ISO booth at 3 in the morning, sitting on the floor with his back against soundproofed walls, tears streaming down his face, holding a cassette tape labeled in handwriting that Dave didn't recognize. What Kurt whispered to Dave in the next 7 minutes would never be discussed publicly, never mentioned in interviews, never acknowledged by either man until Dave finally broke 30 years of silence in a 2023 podcast. And what was on that cassette tape would explain the darkness that consumed Kurt Cobain during the final 14 months of his life. The isolated studio sessions. If you remember 1993, you remember the anticipation surrounding Nirvana's follow-up to Nevermind. That album had sold 10 million copies, spawned the anthem that defined Generation X, and turned 3 guys from the Pacific Northwest into unwilling spokesmen for disaffected youth worldwide. The pressure to deliver a worthy successor was immense, but Kurt Cobain had never responded well to pressure, especially when it came with corporate expectations and mainstream scrutiny. He wanted the next album to be raw, unpolished, deliberately uncommercial, a middle finger to everyone who turned Nirvana into a commodity. That's why he'd chosen Steve Albini to produce, why he'd selected Pachyderm Studio in the middle of nowhere, Minnesota, why he'd insisted on a residential recording environment where the band would live and work together for 2 straight weeks with no outside interference. Subscribe now to uncover the untold stories that shaped the legends of rock music. The barn in the middle of nowhere. Pachyderm Studio wasn't your typical recording facility. Built inside a genuine 19th century barn on 18 acres of frozen Minnesota farmland, the studio was 90 minutes from Minneapolis and might as well have been on another planet for all the connection it had to urban civilization. The nearest town, Cannon Falls, had a population of 4,000 people who mostly kept to themselves and didn't particularly care about famous musicians passing through. In February, temperatures regularly dropped below 0 Fahrenheit, and snow covered everything in a thick white blanket that muffled sound and created the kind of isolation that was either creatively liberating or psychologically crushing, depending on your state of mind. The studio had been designed specifically for residential sessions, with sleeping quarters upstairs, a full kitchen, and enough space that band members could disappear into private corners when they needed breaks from each other's constant company. Nirvana had checked into Pachyderm on February 13, 1993, hauling in their equipment and settling into what would become a grueling 2-week process of recording what eventually became the untold album. Producer Steve Albini, known for his stripped-down recording philosophy and his refusal to polish anything that sounded raw and real, had set up microphones to capture the band's live sound without the studio tricks that had made Nevermind so commercially accessible. Kurt had specifically requested this approach, wanted an album that sounded like Nirvana actually sounded when they played together in a room, without the layering and sweetening that producer Butch Vig had applied to their previous record. But the problem with capturing reality is that reality includes all the imperfections and struggles that polished production usually conceals. The first week of sessions had been productive but increasingly tense. Kurt's perfectionism clashed with his stated desire for raw simplicity, creating a contradiction that manifested in endless takes and growing frustration when performances didn't match whatever ideal existed in his head. His chronic stomach condition, the mysterious digestive issue that had plagued him since adolescence and that he'd been managing with increasingly heavy pharmaceutical assistance, was acting up worse than usual in the Minnesota cold. Chris Novoselic, the band's bassist who'd known Kurt since they were teenagers in Aberdeen, Washington, spent most of his time trying to keep peace between Kurt's artistic vision and the practical limitations of studio time and budget. And Dave Grohl, still relatively new to the dynamics of a band that had existed before he joined, focused on his drumming and tried to navigate the interpersonal tensions that seemed to escalate daily. The breaking point, February 20th, fell on a Saturday, and producer Steve Albini had given everyone the evening off after 6 straight days of intensive recording. Chris had driven into Minneapolis with the studio assistant to see a movie and escape the barn's claustrophobic intensity for a few hours. The assistant engineer had gone to bed early in his upstairs room. Albini himself had retreated to the control room to work on rough mixes, headphones on, absorbed in the technical details of what they'd captured so far. That left Kurt and Dave nominally alone in the main studio space, though Kurt had disappeared into one of the isolation booths around 9 p.m. and hadn't emerged since. Dave had been in the lounge area reading a music magazine, trying to decompress from the week's intensity, when he'd noticed the time. Almost 3 in the morning, and Kurt still hadn't come out of the ISO booth or gone upstairs to the sleeping quarters. This wasn't entirely unusual. Kurt often kept irregular hours, would work on songs or lyrics through the night, when inspiration struck or insomnia prevented sleep. But something about this particular night felt different to Dave. Maybe it was the absolute silence from the ISO booth, when Kurt usually at least played guitar or sang quietly when he was working alone. Maybe it was the instinct that comes from spending intense time with someone, learning to read their moods and patterns even when they're trying to hide what they're feeling. Whatever the reason, Dave put down his magazine, walked across the main studio floor, and approached the ISO booth door. The ISO booth was a small soundproofed room within the larger studio, designed to record individual instruments or vocals without bleed from other sources. It had thick walls covered in acoustic foam, a tiny window in the door, and barely enough space for a person and their instrument. When Dave looked through the window, he could see Kurt sitting on the floor in the corner, knees pulled up to his chest, head down, shoulders shaking in a way that Dave immediately recognized as crying. On the floor beside Kurt was a Walkman cassette player, the kind with the foam headphones that were ubiquitous in the early 90s, and a cassette tape in a clear plastic case. Dave knocked quietly on the door. No response. He knocked again, a little louder this time, and called Kurt's name. The shaking shoulders stilled, and Kurt's head came up slowly. Even through the small window, Dave could see his face was wet with tears, his eyes red, his expression somewhere between anguished and angry at being discovered. For a long moment, the two men just looked at each other through the glass, and Dave was confronted with a choice. He could walk away, give Kurt privacy for whatever he was going through, pretend he hadn't seen anything, and let Kurt maintain the facade he'd been working so hard to keep intact. Or he could open the door and force a confrontation, acknowledge the breakdown that everyone had been pretending wasn't happening, risk Kurt's fury for violating his private suffering. Dave opened the door. The confession that changed everything. The ISO booth smelled like cigarettes and something else Dave couldn't quite identify, maybe sweat, or maybe just the distinctive odor of someone who'd been sitting in a small enclosed space for hours without moving. Kurt was still on the floor, hadn't gotten up when Dave entered, just watched him with red eyes that held equal parts vulnerability and resentment. Dave sat down on the floor facing him, didn't say anything at first, just let the silence stretch between them until Kurt was ready to fill it or tell him to get the hell out. "You okay, man?" Dave finally asked, aware even as he said it how inadequate the question was, how obviously Kurt was not okay in any meaningful sense of the word. Kurt laughed, a short, bitter sound without humor. "Do I look okay?" His voice was rough, probably from crying, possibly from the hours of singing during recording sessions. "Sorry, that's not. I didn't mean to." He trailed off, wiped at his face with the sleeve of his cardigan, that same brown cardigan he seemed to wear constantly regardless of temperature or circumstance. Dave noticed the cassette player and the tape. "What are you listening to?" he asked, nodding toward it. Kurt's hand moved protectively toward the cassette, covering it like someone might shield a wound. "Nothing, just old stuff. Doesn't matter." But it clearly did matter. Mattered enough that Kurt had been sitting alone in an ISO booth for 6 hours in the middle of the night, crying over whatever was on that tape. Dave didn't push, just waited, and eventually Kurt's hand relaxed slightly, moved away from the cassette to rub at his temples like he had a headache, which he probably did given how much crying he'd apparently been doing. "It's demos," Kurt said finally. "Old demos from before Nevermind, before everything changed." He picked up the cassette, turned it over in his hands, examining it like he was seeing it for the first time, even though the wear on the case suggested he'd handled it frequently. "Someone sent it to me a few months ago. Anonymous package, no return address, just this tape with a note that said, 'Remember who you were.'" The bitterness in Kurt's voice when he said those last 4 words was profound, carrying layers of resentment and loss and self-loathing that Dave was only beginning to understand. Kurt continued before Dave could formulate a response. "There's stuff on here from 1990, before you joined, before anyone gave a shit about us. Just me and Chris and Chad, playing in basements and shitty clubs, making music because that's what we did, not because there were gold records or MTV or any of this fucking..." He gestured vaguely at the studio around them, encompassing not just Pachyderm but everything the studio represented, the machinery of commercial success that had transformed their lives. "We were happy then," Kurt said, and his voice broke slightly on the word happy, or at least I was. "I mean, we were broke and nobody cared, and we had no idea if anything would ever happen, but the music was pure, you know? It was ours. And now..." He trailed off again, and Dave watched another tear track down his face, quickly wiped away. What Dave learned that night. For the next 5 minutes, Kurt talked more openly than Dave had ever heard him talk, words spilling out like he'd been holding them back for months or years, and the dam had finally broken. He talked about how success felt like theft, like he'd stolen something that was never meant to be his, and now everyone who'd bought into the corporate version of Nirvana was complicit in the crime. He talked about hating the fans who'd discovered the band through MTV, even though he understood rationally that this hate was misdirected and unfair. He talked about feeling like a fraud every time he played Smells Like Teen Spirit. That song that had become an anthem for people who didn't understand it was meant as satire, not celebration. He talked about the chronic pain in his stomach that made every day a struggle, and the substances he was using to manage that pain that were creating their own problems and dependencies. And then Kurt said something that Dave Grohl would replay in his mind approximately 10,000 times over the next 30 years, especially in the weeks after Kurt's death, when Dave was trying to make sense of what had happened and whether there was anything he could have done differently. Kurt looked directly at Dave and said, in a voice that was quiet but absolutely clear, "Sometimes I think everyone would be better off if Nirvana had never made it, if we'd just stayed small and unknown and I could have just made music without all this weight, all this expectation. And sometimes I think everyone would be better off if I just wasn't here anymore." The statement hung in the air of the small ISO booth like smoke, visible and toxic. Dave felt his stomach drop, felt his mouth go dry, felt the sudden spike of adrenaline that comes with recognizing genuine danger. "Kurt, man, you can't," he started, but Kurt interrupted him. "I'm not saying I'm going to do anything," Kurt said, holding up a hand. I'm tired, Dave. I'm so fucking tired of being Kurt Cobain, whoever that is. I'm tired of the pain and the pressure and pretending I'm okay when I'm not okay. And listening to this tape, hearing who we were before all the bullshit, it just makes it worse because I can't go back, you know. That version of me is gone, and I don't know if I like who replaced him." Dave didn't know what to say. He was 24 years old, barely an adult himself, thrust into a situation that would have challenged someone twice his age with formal psychological training. What do you say to someone who's essentially told you they're thinking about suicide, even if they've hedged it with qualifications and not saying "I'm going to do anything"? What do you say to your friend, your bandmate, someone whose talent you admire and whose company you generally enjoy, when they reveal the depth of their suffering and you realize you've been completely unaware of how bad things had gotten? "We should talk to someone," Dave finally said, "like a professional, someone who can actually help with this stuff." Kurt laughed again, that same bitter sound. "I've talked to professionals, I've talked to therapists and doctors and everyone Courtney insists I see. They give me pills and advice, and none of it helps because the problem isn't chemical, Dave. The problem is that I'm living a life I never wanted, and I don't know how to get out of it without destroying everything and disappointing everyone." "That's not true," Dave said, though he wasn't entirely sure what part of Kurt's statement he was contradicting. "People love you because of your music, not because of fame or success or any of that. The music is still real, even if the rest of it feels fake." "Is it though?" Kurt asked. "Is the music still real when we're recording it in this fancy studio with this famous producer to make an album that a major label is going to spend millions promoting? When did we become the thing we used to hate?" The unspoken agreement. They sat in the ISO booth for another hour, maybe longer, time becoming elastic in the way it does during intense emotional conversations in the middle of the night. Kurt played parts of the cassette for Dave, old demos of songs that would eventually appear on Nevermind and others that never made it past the basement recording stage. Dave listened and understood what Kurt meant about purity and loss, even if he didn't fully agree with Kurt's darker conclusions about whether success had corrupted everything they'd built. The earlier versions were rawer, more immediate, unpolished in ways that felt honest even if they lacked the sonic power of the studio recordings. Eventually, Kurt's crying stopped, replaced by exhaustion and the kind of emotional numbness that follows intense catharsis. They emerged from the ISO booth into the main studio space, where dawn was starting to filter through the barn's windows, grey winter light that matched both their moods. Steve Albini was asleep in the control room, slumped over the mixing board with headphones still on. Christ hadn't returned yet from Minneapolis. The studio felt like a tomb, silent and cold despite the heating system running constantly to fight Minnesota's February freeze. Before they went upstairs to their respective rooms, Kurt grabbed Dave's arm, the physical contact unusual enough that Dave immediately paid attention. "Don't tell anyone about this," Kurt said. "Not Christ, not management, definitely not Courtney. This was just, I was having a bad night. I'm fine now." Dave looked at his friend, at the red eyes and the exhausted slump of his shoulders, and the obvious signs that Kurt was anything but fine, and faced another choice. He could agree to keep the secret, honor Kurt's request for privacy, even though every instinct told him this situation needed intervention and support beyond what he could provide. Or he could break confidence, tell someone in authority about Kurt's breakdown and that terrifying statement about everyone being better off if he wasn't here anymore, risk Kurt's trust and anger but potentially save his life. Dave chose to keep the secret. In 2023, during the podcast where he finally revealed this story, Dave Grohl would describe this choice as one of his greatest regrets. He'd explain that he was young and didn't know how to handle the situation, that Kurt had seemed calmer after talking, that he'd convinced himself the crisis had passed and everything would be okay. But mostly Dave would admit that he'd been scared of overreacting, scared of betraying Kurt's confidence, scared of being the one responsible for forcing an intervention that might destroy their friendship and the band. So he'd nodded, said he wouldn't tell anyone, and watched Kurt climb the stairs to his room, carrying that cassette tape and all the pain it represented. Why Dave kept silent for 3 decades. For 29 years, Dave Grohl never publicly discussed what Kurt had told him in that ISO booth at Pachyderm. He gave hundreds of interviews about Nirvana, talked about Kurt's talent and humor and complexity, participated in documentaries and tribute albums, and all the various ways that culture processes and commemorates dead rock stars. But he never mentioned the cassette tape or the crying or that terrible statement about everyone being better off if Kurt wasn't here anymore. He kept the secret even though keeping it meant carrying the burden alone, meant second-guessing his choices, meant wondering if his silence had somehow contributed to the outcome he'd been trying to prevent. In the 2023 podcast where Dave finally revealed the story, he explained his reasons for the 3 decades of silence. Part of it was honoring Kurt's request for privacy, respecting his friend's wishes even after death. Part of it was protecting Courtney Love and Francis Bean Cobain from additional pain, not wanting to add another layer of tragedy to an already devastating loss. Part of it was self-protection, not wanting to face the public judgment that would inevitably come with admitting he'd known how serious Kurt's problems were and hadn't done more to help. And part of it was simple shame, the guilt of a survivor who'd been there for a crucial moment and had made a choice that seemed reasonable at the time but looked increasingly questionable with the perspective that 3 decades provides. But mostly, Dave said, he'd kept silent because talking about it wouldn't change anything. Kurt Cobain was still dead. That night at Pachyderm had still happened. The choices Dave had made were still the choices he'd made, and no amount of public confession would undo them or bring Kurt back or make the guilt feel any lighter. So Dave had carried the memory privately, had let it inform his own approach to mental health and checking in on friends and recognizing warning signs, had tried to honor Kurt's memory by learning from the tragedy rather than just being consumed by it. What the cassette revealed, the cassette tape that Kurt had been listening to that night, the one that had triggered his breakdown in the ISO booth, was never recovered after his death. Courtney Love inventoried Kurt's possessions extensively after April 1994, looking for clues or explanations or anything that might help her understand what had happened, but no tape matching Dave's description was ever found. Either Kurt had gotten rid of it at some point during those final 14 months, or it was still somewhere among his belongings in a place nobody ever thought to look, or possibly it had been taken by someone else during the chaotic period after his death when friends and family were sorting through the house. The identity of whoever sent Kurt that tape also remains unknown. Dave's description of an anonymous package with a note saying, "Remember who you were," suggests someone from Nirvana's early days, maybe someone from the Seattle scene who'd known the band when they were still underground and resented what mainstream success had done to them. Or possibly, it was someone with more complex motivations, someone who understood that nostalgia could be as much weapon as gift, that reminding Kurt of his pre-fame happiness might increase his suffering rather than alleviate it. Without the tape or sender being identified, these questions remain speculative, just another mystery in the complicated puzzle of Kurt Cobain's final years. But whether the tape survived or not, whether the sender is ever identified or remains forever anonymous, the impact it had that February night is documented through Dave's testimony. It provided a window into Kurt's internal struggle, his feeling that success had corrupted something pure, his exhaustion with being a public figure, his thought that maybe everyone would be better off without him. These weren't new feelings, probably weren't even particularly surprising to anyone who'd been paying attention to Kurt's interviews and lyrics during that period. But hearing them articulated so directly, without the protective filter of sarcasm or artistic metaphor, made them real in a way that couldn't be ignored or rationalized away. The burden Dave carries. In the 3 decades since Kurt's death, Dave Grohl has built an extraordinary career with Foo Fighters, has become one of rock music's most respected and beloved figures, has achieved success and stability that would have seemed impossible during the chaotic Nirvana years. But in interviews, especially in recent years as he's entered his 50s and become more reflective about his past, Dave has been increasingly open about the emotional toll of Kurt's death and his own complicated feelings about how things ended. He's talked about survivor's guilt, about the strange experience of continuing to profit from Nirvana's music while Kurt isn't here to share in it, about the weight of being one of the last people to have deep conversations with someone before they died. The 2023 revelation about the ISO booth conversation added another layer to this ongoing process of public reflection. Dave described that night as the moment he truly understood how serious Kurt's problems were, but also the moment he failed to act on that understanding in a way that might have made a difference. He's been clear that he doesn't know whether breaking confidence and forcing an intervention in February 1993 would have changed anything, acknowledges that Kurt's issues were deep and long-standing and probably beyond any single person's ability to fix. But not knowing doesn't eliminate the guilt, doesn't stop the midnight thoughts about alternative timelines where different choices led to different outcomes. This burden, Dave has said, is part of why he's so vocal now about mental health awareness, so insistent that people check in on their friends, so willing to talk openly about depression and addiction, and the ways that fame and success can amplify existing problems rather than solve them. If sharing his story about that night at Pachyderm helps even one person recognize warning signs in someone they love, helps one person choose to break confidence and force intervention even at the risk of anger and resentment, then maybe carrying the burden of that memory for 30 years serves some purpose beyond just personal suffering. The final truth. The night Dave Grohl found Kurt Cobain crying in the ISO booth at Pachyderm Studio wasn't the moment that determined Kurt's fate. The trajectory was already set. The problems already deeply rooted, the outcome probably already inevitable by February 1993, given the combination of addiction, depression, chronic pain, and the specific pressures of unwanted fame that Kurt was struggling with. But it was a moment of revelation, a window into private suffering that usually remained hidden, a chance for intervention that wasn't taken for complicated reasons that seemed defensible at the time, but look increasingly questionable with hindsight. What Kurt said to Dave that night, about everyone being better off if he wasn't here anymore, was both a cry for help and a statement of fact about how he was feeling in that moment. It wasn't a firm decision or a concrete plan, just the articulation of thoughts that had probably been circling in Kurt's mind for months or years. Dave's choice to keep it secret rather than force intervention was understandable given his age and inexperience and Kurt's explicit request for privacy. Whether a different choice would have changed anything is unknowable, belongs to the realm of speculation and alternate histories that provide no real comfort to the people left behind. The cassette tape with the old demos, the physical object that triggered Kurt's breakdown that night, represented something larger than just nostalgic recordings. It represented the gap between who Kurt had been and who fame had forced him to become, the loss of innocence that comes with commercial success, the impossible desire to return to a simpler time before everything became so complicated. That gap, that loss, that impossible desire, these were the real problems Kurt was struggling with, and no amount of therapy or intervention or love from friends and family could close that gap once it had opened wide enough. 3 decades later, Dave Grohl still carries the memory of that night, still hears Kurt's voice saying those terrible words, still wonders if he made the right choice keeping the secret. The burden hasn't gotten lighter with time, just more familiar, integrated into who Dave is as a person and an artist. And the story, finally told after 3 decades of silence, stands as testimony to the limits of friendship and intervention, the ways that sometimes we can see someone drowning and still not be able to save them, the cruel truth that love and concern aren't always enough when the darkness runs deep enough and has been fed long enough. This is what happened on a February night in 1993 in a small soundproofed booth in a barn in rural Minnesota between 2 musicians who were friends and bandmates and who both survived that night, but only one survived the next 14 months. It mattered, it was real, and 30 years later, Dave Grohl finally broke his silence, not because the truth changes anything about what happened, but because carrying secrets alone is its own kind of death, and sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to finally tell the truth about how much their living mattered, how desperately people tried to help, and how inadequate all that trying ultimately proved to be.